The F-86 Sabre is rightly celebrated for its role in the Korean War. Between 1950 and 1954, it was the best day fighter in the world. Although rapidly surpassed by the relentless pace of jet aircraft design, for 2 decades afterwards it performed valuable services in many air arms, giving tens of thousands of pilots their first taste of a truly high-performance aircraft. In 1954, its successor arrived, also a product of the extraordinarily innovative design team at North American Aviation. The F-100 Super Sabre promised supersonic performance, superior weapons, range, and payload. Although it endured a troubled gestation, the Super Sabre would ultimately go on to be one of the most active combat aircraft deployed by the US Air Force, amassing over 360,000 sorties in Vietnam. Whereas the Sabre was a beautifully resolved, magnificently agile fighter, the F-100 was a brute for the 1950s, a powerful, fast, but heavy and relatively unmaneuverable aircraft, whose pilots referred to it as the lead sled. It wasn't the first to carry that name, and doubtless it won't be the last. But the original Sabre's story did not end, as many would think, with the legendary F-86F. It was not killed by the F-100. There was one final US Sabre model to carry the flame for a simpler time. The Hog, the last of the sport models. This is its story. The F-86 was developed in an era in which nuclear weapons were only just beginning to be considered as part of the tactical inventory. In lieu of a better idea, it was designed as a pure air superiority fighter. The Sabre was intended to find and engage enemy fighters and to shoot them down. By the early 1950s, there was a rising belief in the Air Force that delivery of air-to-ground ordnance, particularly nuclear weapons, was more important than fighting other fighters. The final F-86 F-35 block off the North American production line were therefore wired for special stores, the Mark 12 atomic bomb. The F-86 was a very accurate delivery platform for ordnance, but it lacked range, and with the extended 6.3 wings, it was more comfortable operating at high altitudes than on the deck in the weeds. Ever entrepreneurial, North American duly proposed a new version of the Sabre powered by the new General Electric J73 engine instead of the J47. This change increased power by 50% to 8,920 pounds of thrust. The engine was shorter and narrower, but required a much greater volume of air at maximum power and hence a larger intake. To facilitate this, North American deepened the fuselage by 6 inches. A side benefit of this was increased volume in the fuselage and thus 29% greater fuel capacity. Given that they had already made thousands of Sabres by this point, North American went straight to the YF-86H. Although on the surface this was a reasonable decision, as so often happens with military procurement, things did not pan out quite so well as they expected. In the early 1950s, as the idea for the Sabre Hog was taking shape, GE was working on a new high-powered turbojet engine called the J53. This was intended to be a bomber power plant. In the end, the J53 hit too many developmental issues and the program was terminated. That engine lived on, however, in the J73, which was in effect a shrunk-down version of the J53, rather than a development of the J47, as is sometimes assumed because of its early designation of J4721. It used many of the J53's innovative features: variable inlet guide vanes, can-annular combustion for ease of maintenance, a 2-stage turbine, and extensive use of titanium, a metal that was still very challenging to work with. The result was a relatively small engine. It was roughly the same size as the J47 in the Sabre, but one that produced 9,200 pounds of thrust on the test bench, It was, however, ultimately rated at £8,920 in service. To give you a point of comparison, the Pratt & Whitney J57P7 in the F100A Super Sabre produced £9,700 of thrust, whereas the J57 weighed about £5,000 and was 22 feet 3 inches long. The J73 was only 12 and a quarter feet long and weighed £3,800 before it was built up. Both engines were a little over 3 feet in diameter. Now, obviously the J57 proved to be able of much increased power levels in later models of the Super Sabre, but the fact is that the J73 was something of a marvel. It also went undeveloped. The F-86H was the only production aircraft to utilize the J73. It therefore suffered alone with the engine's teething problems. Resolving these issues was complicated by a lack of adequate logistical support. The J73 would be produced in 4 variants, each of which increased reliability and maintainability. But the engines weren't interchangeable, and the airframe had to be modified before the next engine in the series could be installed. Up to 100 maintenance man-hours were required for the modification. The total production run of engines amounted to 870 units. Given that only 473 Sabre Hogs were built to production standard, the ratio of engines to aircraft was just 1.84 to 1. Fuel for the engine was supplied from 5 tanks. The Sabre Hog benefited from developments that had made the original Sabre such a success. For example, single-point fueling was fitted to ease ground handling. Engine access was possible through the fuselage brake just behind the wing root. As a final note, you may also have noticed a pronounced scoop on the fuselage side. This is to provide cooling for the engine accessories. The Air Force's intention for the Hog was to arm it with the M39 20mm cannons that had been tried out during the Gunval experiments in Korea. But Gunval didn't conclude until May of 1953, and it was at best inconclusive. Although 6 MiGs were downed by Gunval Sabres, 2 Sabres were lost to gun gas ingestion problems, which, although improved by modifications made during the program, were never fully corrected. These issues resulted in the first 115 production aircraft being fitted with the classic Sabre armament of 6 50 caliber machine guns. These are the Block 1 aircraft. Cannons were introduced in Block 5 and were fitted thereafter. I've talked about both of these weapon systems in detail before, so I'll spare you some of the repetition. But in short, the M39 was a remarkable weapon in the same way that the J73 was a remarkable engine. Both were innovative systems, and both were troubled because of that innovativeness. The M39, however, would benefit from a lot more development. Issues with it went well beyond the test aircraft and into production examples. There were 2 sources of trouble. First, and more importantly, the gun itself, which had multiple design issues. Second, there was the specific installation on the Sabre, in particular the seemingly pervasive gas ingestion problems. Starting with the gun, M39s were made by Pontiac, a division of General Motors. As delivered to North American, the guns suffered a stoppage every 500 rounds fired. Such was the wear on the weapons that they were unusable after an average of 4,000 rounds had been fired. This kind of performance was unacceptable for a weapon in wartime. To give you a sense of the issue, years later in Vietnam, the F-5 Tigers fired about 200 rounds of 20mm per day per plane. If the M39 had gone unmodified, then they would have been suffering a failure every mission, and would have had to replace both guns after just 20 days. That's approaching useless in a real war scenario. With Pontiac making little progress, GM's great rivals at Ford Motor Company were therefore brought in to modify the M39. That must have really hurt. Their first round of improvements focused on the receiver, drum support, round retainer, drum shaft slide assembly, electrical hardness, and feeder assembly. This did improve matters. Stoppages were now down to 1.1 times per 1,000 rounds fired, but service life was little better. So Ford now turned their attention to the problem of double feeding of ammunition. They tried two systems, one of which reduced stoppages to once every 2,800 rounds in the F-86H. The same system in the F-100A resulted in a stoppage rate of once every 3,762 rounds fired. With that problem solved, the next issue was that of stalling. This had been a constant issue during gun val, particularly at high altitude. Fortunately, the J-73 appeared to be less susceptible to compressor stalls than the J-47, so the system of purging gun gas into the air intake, developed on the F-86F, was retained. Stalls did occur, but the Air Force was unconcerned and pressed ahead. The majority of Sabre Hogs therefore carried the 420mm cannons and 150 rounds per gun. Given the maneuverability of the Sabre and its stable, forgiving characteristics as a gun platform, this combination would have likely to have been deadly both in air-to-air combat and strafing situations. For completeness, I should say that the sight and gun ranging radar are the same as that on the late Model F. There's no search radar, and the Hog was strictly a clear air fighter. Two other weapons are worth talking about. Some of the 300 F-86H Hogs were modified to fire the then new AIM-9B Sidewinder. These and some Fs were the only USAF Sabres to carry the Sidewinder in service. Two pylons were fitted under wing, and additional switches were mounted in the cockpit in various places. Although it comes in for a lot of criticism, the AIM-9B was a big capability upgrade for the Sabre. It extended the possible engagement range from a few hundred yards to a mile or more. Sidewinder also allowed engagement of targets flying thousands of feet above the firing aircraft, important if fighting against the MiG-17, which had a higher service ceiling than the Sabre. The other weapon of note is the Special Store. The Hog was, after all, intended to deliver nuclear weapons at low level. For this reason, it was equipped with the Low Altitude Bombing System, or LABS. In this case, the Special Store was the Mark 12 fission bomb. The Mark 12 was the second tactical nuclear weapon in the US inventory. The weapon had a yield between 12 and 14 kilotons, roughly the same as Little Boy at Hiroshima. For the nuclear mission, the Sabre Hog would carry the Special Store on the left wing inboard pylon. 200-gallon tanks would be carried on the outboard pylons and a 120-gallon tank on the right inboard. To employ the weapon, the pilot approached based on instructions from labs. This meant a fast, low-altitude approach followed by a sharp pull-up into a loop. The bomb was released near the top of the loop, at which point the pilot escaped by performing an Immelman turn. Because it was traveling on a ballistic trajectory, the bomb would take some seconds to get to the right position and height for the fuse to detonate the device. In theory, that was long enough for the pilot to escape the blast radius. Thankfully, we never got to find out about the practice. Inevitably, the stockier fuselage containing the new engine and powerful new armament needed some wings to lift them. Interestingly, the first prototypes were initially delivered with the slatted wings of the F-86E and early F-86Fs, rather than the 6.3 wing fitted to many F-25 and later Sabres. Presumably, there was an assumption at North American that the more powerful engine and low-level attack brief would negate the need for a large, thin wing. The first of these aircraft took its first flight on April 30th, 1953. It quickly exhibited troubling high and low speed handling issues. At 25,000 feet, maneuverability was so poor as to make the Sabre unusable as a dogfighter. At 40,000 feet, the Hog couldn't pull more than 1.5 G. It would be a sitting duck in a fight. At slow speeds, the approach to stall and the control response during the stall itself were also deemed to be unacceptable. From the 9th flight onwards, it and the other test article were fitted with the classic 6.3 wings and their fixed leading edge rather than the moving slats. If you want to know more about Sabre wings, then my video on the Day Fighter Sabres goes into it in some depth. I'll link to that in the show notes. Although high-altitude maneuverability improved somewhat, without slats, the Hog was not a friendly aircraft to fly at low altitude. Even when clean, mild buffeting started at 175 knots of indicated airspeed. The aircraft could be flown through this down to 122 knots, at which point complete stall occurred. Stall performance was thus more predictable than with the slats, but landing speeds remained very high. Unfortunately, performance with the gear and flaps down was pretty terrifying. At 128 knots, the nose would yaw to the right and the left wing would drop. The test pilots could fly it down to 109 knots, but it was a scary ride. There followed a program of over 130 flights with multiple different combinations of slat types, wing lengths, and profiles. Eventually, the Air Force and North Americans settled on the same wing that was fitted to the F-40 batch of Sabres, which was itself the same as the wing fitted to Japanese Sabres. This was the 6.3 profile, but with a 12-inch tip extension and leading-edge slats. This wing gave excellent turning performance at medium altitudes and was good enough above 45,000 feet. Stall warning was good, there was minimal rolling off during the stall itself, and in general the Hog was reasonable in the landing pattern, although it would still catch out many pilots over its career. Because of the accelerated development program, only the last 10 Sabre Hogs to be built had this wing. The other 475 aircraft built were delivered either with slatted wings of the early F model Sabre or the 6.3 wing. Most of these would be refitted with the best wing design in the first years of their service life. Sabre Hogs began to enter service in the fall of 1954 and the production was complete by 1956. 113 were built with machine guns, of which 14 had the slatted wing and the remaining 99 had the solid 6.3. The next 50, designated H5, had the 20mm cannons, an upgraded engine and the 6.3 wing. The final 300, designated H10, had the final iteration of the J73, which was a little lighter and rather more reliable. The last 10 of these were built with the extended slatted F40 wing, and as I said, most of the remainder received it over their service life. It should be said that this modification put a lot of pressure on maintenance in those early years. To make things easy, I'm going to use the F40 wing H10 as the basis for comparisons and discussion of the flight characteristics. In this configuration, the Sabre Hog was thus 16 inches longer than the F-86 F40, but had the same wingspan. The rudder was 3 inches higher, and in order to increase stability, the tail planes did not feature the 3-degree dihedral of the original Sabre. Weight was very much greater in the Hog. Its empty weight was just over 13,800 pounds versus 11,125 pounds for the F40. With a lot more power on tap, the maximum takeoff weight went up by 4,000 pounds to 24,300. Only the F-86L had equivalent empty weight, and no Sabre could lift so much at maximum weight. The powerful engine also resulted in the fastest climb rate of any Sabre produced for any air arm at 12,900 feet per minute. Ceiling was theoretically 50,800 feet, but as I said a moment ago, handling at this altitude was questionable, so the statistics are basically academic. Superior power and thrust-to-weight ratio meant that the Hog's top speed went up to 692 miles an hour from 678 on the F40. This more or less matches the more aerodynamic F models with the 6.3 wing, like the classic F-25. The design was running into issues with critical Mach number at this point, so going faster wasn't really on the cards. So that was the good news. The downside was that the heavier Hog had higher wing loading than the F-86F and therefore couldn't really compete with it in a dogfight. This was worse for those Hogs fitted with the slatted wing, but was also true for the 6.3 and F-40 aircraft. At medium altitudes and using the vertical as well as the horizontal plane, a well-flown Hog was not a pushover for an F, but the older aircraft was the superior dogfighter. In general, though, outside of the landing pattern, the F-86H was a docile, easy aircraft to fly. When flown against later aircraft, the Hog was a very dangerous opponent. The 1965 Feather Duster tests, in which Air National Guard Hogs played the part of North Vietnamese MiG-17s, demonstrated this fact. In essence, the testing revealed that the only way an F-100 could beat its predecessor was in a hit-and-run attack. As soon as he attempted to turn, the pilot would be in dire straits. Any attempt to flee would result in an AIM-9 shot for the Sabre. F-104s and F-4s had the option of a vertical fight, but even this was dicey if the attacker was alert. The Sabre's low wing loading and good all-round visibility meant that it was often able to spoil gun and missile attacks even when on the defensive. In 1966, the Hogs were also used to simulate the MiG-19, which seems like a stretch given how different that aircraft is from the Sabre. Even so, all of this begs the question as to why the Sabre Hogs were not sent to Vietnam to tackle the MiG-17 that was so troubling to the F-100 and F-4. If you do the straight-up comparison between the full beans F-86H and the cooking MiG-17 without afterburner, then the Hog looks better across the board. Although larger and more than 30% heavier, much greater power and a larger wing results in similar wing loading. The Hog also has a 10% advantage in thrust to weight. It also has superior visibility out of the cockpit, a wider operating envelope, and significantly superior weapons for air-to-air use. Given that the Sabre could also hang two Sidewinders under the wings, it looks like a good option on the face of it. The Super Sabre's only advantage is top speed, but in the early days of Rolling Thunder, the fighters didn't go in deep with the strikers and there was no SAM threat. There were, however, some issues to contend with. Operationally, the Sabre Hog lacked aerial refueling capability. This would have been problematic given the long mission durations commonplace in Vietnam. The Hog was limited to 1.5-hour-long missions at maximum. Another significant issue that was rearing its head by this stage in the Hog's life was lack of parts availability. The Sabre Hog was produced in relatively small numbers, as was the J-73 engine. Any major failure of the latter now essentially meant that the aircraft would be useless as there were next to no spares. Availability rates for the F-86H were generally quite poor because of this. And although there were maintenance techs with experience on the type, they were fewer and further between them for the Super Sabre or F-4. So in isolation, the Sabre looks like a better option than the Super. I suspect in reality there was no point in deploying it. If the TAC had taken air-to-air more seriously in the late 1950s, then Phantom crews would have been better prepared and able to use the F-4's outstanding power to best the MiG-17. As it was, pilot quality was likely better in the Air National Guard squadrons, particularly those that are deployed to Europe. There are plenty of stories of their antics dogfighting with the Canadians in Germany. The average TAC pilot just didn't get that opportunity because of safety considerations. Interestingly, the air-to-air mission was actually a big part of the Hog's focus in its early life. The Super Sabre had proved to be treacherous, and its supersonic speed was needed as a nuclear weapon delivery platform in Europe due to improving Soviet defenses. The Sabre Hog therefore took on the air superiority mission as it was at that time until F-100Cs began to appear in the late 1950s. At this point, the Sabres reverted to an air-to-ground focus, although rarely with special stores. 750-pound general-purpose bombs or rockets were the order of the day when the Guard deployed to Europe on force surges. And it was the Guard who made the most use of the Sabre Hog. By 1960, they were the type's exclusive user and operated until the airframes wore out in the early 1970s. Because the TAC didn't fancy buying the F-5 Freedom Fighter in quantity, the old Sabre Hog was actually the best close air support platform the Air Force had until McNamara forced them to buy the LTV Corsair II. This came into service in 1970. So for 15 years, long after the Sabre dogs had gone to the boneyard, the Hog flew the flag for the F-86. It remained a useful part of the inventory and much loved by its pilots. New York ANG was, I believe, the last to operate it, surrendering their last aircraft sometime in 1971. Complexity and scarcity meant that the Sabre Hog was never exported. It arrived too late for Korea, and as I mentioned, it was not deployed to Vietnam. At the end of their lives, many were scrapped without ceremony. Some were expended as aerial targets in the drone program in the 1970s and early 80s. A few survive in museums, where I imagine their uniqueness and capabilities are often confused with the original Sabre. Whether it was actually a better aircraft depends on what you're using it for. As a multi-purpose fighter-bomber, there is no contest. The Sabre Hog has more range, more firepower, and is faster at low level. As a pure fighter, however, my view is that the F-40 Sabre was the better air-to-air fighter in the period, provided we assume we could fit it with the Sidewinder. And for now at least, we will keep away from the discussion of the merits of Canadian and Australian Sabres. So that's the Sabre Hog, the last of the sport models. In another era, it would probably have its own name and be more celebrated. Hopefully this video has gone some way to increasing recognition of it.